When you think about evil, most people picture Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, names that have become synonymous with terror. But what if I told you that some of the most chilling serial killers in history have names you've probably never heard? Not because their crimes were less horrific, but because their stories were buried, forgotten, or simply overshadowed by more famous monsters. Today, we're diving into the darkest corners of criminal history to uncover three serial killers whose names should haunt your nightmares, but somehow slipped through the cracks of public memory. These aren't just murderers, these are predators who operated in the shadows, leaving behind trails of destruction that would make even seasoned investigators sick to their stomachs. Our first killer was a drifter who claimed to have murdered over 70 people across multiple countries. He didn't kill for money or fame. He killed because he wanted to watch the world burn. The second was a family man who lived next door to his victims, hunting them for sport in the Alaskan wilderness like they were nothing more than animals. And the third was a monster who believed he was doing God's work, cleansing the streets of those he deemed unworthy of life. These stories will disturb you. They'll make you question how such evil can exist in plain sight. But they need to be told because forgetting these monsters means forgetting their victims, and that's something we can never allow to happen. Let me start with Karl Panzram, a name that should be spoken in the same breath as history's most notorious killers, but somehow isn't. Karl wasn't just a murderer. He was a walking apocalypse, a man who dedicated his entire existence to causing as much pain and suffering as humanly possible. Picture this, it's 1928, and inside the suffocating walls of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, a man sits in complete silence. A guard, more out of curiosity than compassion, hands him a pencil and some paper. The man takes it without a word. Over the next several weeks, he fills page after page with his memories, his thoughts, his crimes, his twisted philosophy. What emerges is one of the most chilling confessions in American history. This man had no desire for pity, no illusions of redemption. He simply wanted the world to know what he had done and why. That man was Karl Panzram, and what he wrote wasn't a cry for help. It was a manifesto of pure, undiluted hatred. Karl was born in 1891 in rural Minnesota, raised on a struggling farm during a time when children were expected to act like adults long before they were ready. His father abandoned the family early on, leaving his mother burdened and exhausted, with little time or warmth to offer her son. By age 7, Karl was already in trouble, committing petty thefts, getting into fights, breaking into houses. By age 11, he was drinking heavily. That same year, he was sent to a reform school for what authorities called incorrigible behavior. But what happened in that school changed him forever. According to Karl, it wasn't a place of education, but of punishment, where discipline crossed into outright cruelty. The goal wasn't to help children, it was to break them completely. He would later describe this experience as the moment something inside him turned off permanently. He stopped believing in people, stopped trusting anyone, and began to feel something darker take root deep in his soul, resentment, and eventually pure hatred. By his teenage years, Karl was constantly on the run, jumping trains, stealing whatever he could, getting arrested under fake names, then disappearing before authorities could figure out who he really was. He became a true drifter, traveling from state to state, always angry, always armed with a massive chip on his shoulder. But here's what made Carl different from most criminals. He wasn't stealing to survive. He stole because he genuinely enjoyed it. He broke into homes not just for money, but for the pure thrill of violation, and sometimes for revenge against a world that had wronged him. President. Yes, you heard that right. Carl actually broke into the home of William Howard Taft, stealing money, valuables, and even a pistol. He later used those stolen funds to buy a boat, an actual yacht, which he used to cruise up and down the East Coast. But this boat wasn't for sightseeing. According to Carl's own twisted testimony, it became a floating crime scene. He would lure people on board with promises of work or shelter, only for them to vanish without a trace. Many of these disappearances were never connected to him at the time, but later he would describe them in vivid, nauseating detail in his written confession. Over the years, Carl traveled far beyond the United States. He drifted through Mexico, Europe, and Africa, always under different names. In each new place, the same horrific pattern repeated: theft, violence, then disappearance. He claimed to have committed crimes in at least a dozen countries. Most were never verified, but the consistency of his stories, the specific locations, the eerie timelines, they all suggest that at the very least, he wasn't fabricating everything. He was arrested numerous times under dozens of different aliases, but every single time he was locked up, he found a way to escape. In one instance, he actually bent the metal bars of his jail cell using nothing but his body weight and brute force. In another, he faked cooperation long enough to steal keys from a guard. He was like a ghost, appearing in one city, vanishing in the next, and with every escape, he seemed to grow bolder, more ruthless, and more committed to his personal mission, to cause as much chaos as humanly possible. Eventually, though, even Carl ran out of luck. He was finally identified and sentenced to a long prison term at Leavenworth. And this time, something was different. Maybe he knew he wouldn't get out. Maybe he didn't want to. He started to open up, not to the prison system, but to a young guard named Henry Lesser, who treated him like a human being. Henry gave him writing supplies and asked him to tell his story. What came out was more than just a memoir. It was a psychological profile of a man who had completely disconnected from society. Carl wrote candidly with no apologies whatsoever. He described his crimes not as mistakes, but as deliberate choices. He explained how he had come to see life as nothing more than a game of power, where causing pain was the only thing that ever made him feel truly alive. "I don't believe in man, God, nor the devil," he wrote. In one of the final chapters of his miserable life, Carl committed one last act of violence inside the prison walls. A dispute with a staff member turned deadly, and Carl was sentenced to death. When asked if he wanted to appeal, he refused. When asked if he had any last words, he said something so cold and casual that even the hardened guards were stunned. "Hurry it up," he said. On September 5th, 1930, Carl Panzram was executed by hanging. He was 39 years old. His story faded into obscurity for decades, until the manuscript he left behind was finally published. It's now regarded by criminologists and historians as one of the most unfiltered looks into the mind of a career criminal. But here's what makes Carl's story so chilling. It's not just what he did, it's how self-aware he was about it. He knew exactly what he had become. He chose it. He embraced it completely. He claimed to have killed 21 people, though some believe the number was even higher. But Karl Panzram didn't keep trophies. He didn't hide bodies. He didn't care if he got caught. His only regret was that he hadn't killed more people. What do we do with stories like Karl Panzram's? It's easy to label him as pure evil, but when you peel back the layers, the story becomes more complicated and far more unsettling. Here was a person shaped by cruelty who became cruel in return, a child hurt by systems that claimed to be protecting him, who grew up to hurt others without a shred of remorse. Karl wasn't born a monster. He was made into one, piece by piece, cruelty by cruelty. And that's what makes his story so terrifying. The second case brings us to a killer who operated right under society's nose, blending into the fabric of everyday life while carrying out some of the most calculated and methodical murders in American history. This is the story of a man who didn't need fame or recognition, who didn't crave the spotlight that other killers sought. He simply wanted to kill, and he was terrifyingly good at it. Carl Eugene Watts was born in 1953 in Texas, and from the outside, his early life seemed relatively normal. He wasn't the product of extreme poverty or obvious abuse like so many other killers. But when Carl was 8 years old, something happened that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. He contracted viral meningitis, and while he survived the illness, it left him changed in ways that wouldn't become apparent for years. The infection seemed to rewire something deep in Carl's brain. Where he had once been a typical shy child, he became emotionally detached, cold, and increasingly isolated from the world around him. His social interactions became minimal and strained. More disturbing were the drawings he began creating, violent and disturbing images that seemed to pour out of him like a dark confession of what was brewing inside. As Carl entered his teenage years, these changes became more pronounced and far more dangerous. He began experiencing what he called nightmares, but these weren't typical dreams. They were vivid, detailed fantasies of stalking and killing women. In these dreams, he would hunt his victims, attack them, and feel a sense of peace and control that he couldn't find anywhere else in his life. The line between fantasy and reality began to blur. At 15, Carl crossed that line. He attacked a woman he didn't know, a random target he had ambushed and stabbed. She survived, barely, and Carl was arrested. The psychiatric evaluation that followed painted a chilling picture of his mental state. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and doctors warned that he posed a severe risk for future violence. But the system failed. Carl spent only 2 months in a psychiatric facility before being released back into society. The authorities believed he was manageable, that whatever darkness had driven him to violence could be controlled. They were catastrophically wrong. Carl hadn't been cured or rehabilitated. He had simply learned to hide his true nature better. He slipped back into society like a ghost, blending in with the kind of ordinary invisibility that would make him one of the most dangerous killers in American history. By the time Carl was 20, the urges had become impossible to ignore. But what made him different from other serial killers was his complete lack of a traditional motive. He didn't choose his victims based on personal vendettas or sexual gratification. He didn't need them to fit a specific profile or remind him of someone from his past. Carl believed, in his twisted worldview, that certain women were simply evil, that something inside them needed to be erased from existence. He couldn't explain why he felt this way about specific women. It was purely instinctual, a gut feeling that would wash over him when he encountered certain targets. Once that feeling took hold, once he decided that a woman was somehow flawed or unworthy of life, her fate was sealed. There was no reasoning with him, no way to change his mind. He had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. Carl's killing spree began in 1974 when he moved to Detroit. The city was already drowning in violence, gang wars, drug-related murders, and economic collapse. It was the perfect hunting ground for someone like Carl because another body, another unsolved murder, would barely register in the chaos. Detroit police were overwhelmed, understaffed, and dealing with so much violent crime that individual cases often got lost in the shuffle. The first victim was strangled in her apartment. The next was drowned in her bathtub. The third was beaten with a pipe and dumped in a back alley. Different methods, different neighborhoods, different victims, no connections, no suspects, just silence and corpses. And that was exactly what Carl wanted, because he wasn't trying to get caught. He wasn't seeking fame or recognition. He simply wanted to kill, and he wanted to do it without interference. What made Carl so terrifying wasn't just the brutality of his crimes, but how he carried them out. There was no pattern for police to follow, no signature to identify, no calling card left behind. He never used the same method twice, never targeted the same type of victim consistently, never operated in the same area repeatedly. This made him essentially invisible to law enforcement. Carl would select his victims carefully, choosing women who were alone and isolated, people who wouldn't be missed immediately. Some were students trying to make ends meet, others were elderly women living by themselves, and some were barely surviving on the margins of society. He didn't care about their backgrounds, their dreams, or their families. Once he decided they were broken, twisted, or unclean in his mind, he acted. The methods varied horrifically: strangulation, blunt force trauma, drowning, stabbing. Each murder was different, each one untraceable back to the others. By the time the police found one victim and started their investigation, Carl was already gone, already planning his next attack. He didn't kill for lust or power. He didn't collect trophies or revisit crime scenes. He just wanted his victims gone, erased from existence. Over the next 6 years, the murders continued with a chilling regularity. Silent, cold, ruthless. Some happened in the middle of the night, when his victims were most vulnerable. Others occurred in broad daylight, proving that Carl felt no fear of being caught. There was no rhythm for investigators to detect, no pattern to follow, no geographical clustering to narrow down their search. The only consistency was the outcome. The victims didn't survive, and Carl didn't leave a trace. He was like a shadow moving through Detroit, taking lives and disappearing back into the urban landscape. The city's overwhelmed police force couldn't connect the dots because there were no dots to connect. Each murder looked random, isolated, unrelated to the others. By 1981, Carl had killed so many women in Detroit that even he began to feel the pressure. The city, despite its size and chaos, was starting to feel too small for his activities. He needed new territory, fresh hunting grounds, where he could continue his work without the accumulated risk of his past crimes. So he moved to Houston, Texas, seeking the anonymity that a larger city could provide. Houston was perfect for Carl's purposes. It was massive but sprawling and had its own share of urban violence that would help camouflage his activities. Within weeks of arriving, he had resumed killing, but this time something changed in his approach. Carl fell into a more defined pattern, a dark routine that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Most of his attacks in Houston happened on Sunday mornings. He would target women who were alone in their apartments, often people who were preparing for church or just starting their day. These victims were at their most vulnerable, relaxed, and unprepared for violence. Carl would find an unlocked entrance or create a pretext to gain entry, perhaps asking to borrow something or claiming he needed help. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't act erratically or give off obvious warning signs. But the moment he stepped inside and the door closed behind him, death followed. He attacked with terrifying speed and efficiency. There was no build-up, no lengthy conversation, no hesitation. It was like watching someone flip a switch from normal to lethal in an instant. The media began calling him the Sunday morning slasher, but police still had no idea who he was or how to catch him. The attacks were still too varied, the victims too spread out across the massive Houston metropolitan area. Without physical evidence or witnesses, investigators were essentially working blind. Then, on May 23, 1982, Carl made the mistake that would end his reign of terror. He targeted two young women, Melinda Aguilar and Lori Lister, forcing his way into their apartment and binding them both. He began to drown Lori in the bathtub, but Melinda managed to break free from her restraints. In a desperate act of survival, she sprinted to the apartment balcony and jumped from the second floor. She hit the ground hard, shattering bones and covering herself in blood, but she was alive and she could still move. Barefoot and bleeding, she ran screaming across the parking lot until she found a neighbor who called 911. When police arrived at the apartment complex, they found Carl calmly walking out of the building. He showed no signs of panic, no indication that he had just committed a violent crime. He looked like any other resident leaving for work or running errands. But when officers stopped him for questioning, something unexpected happened. Carl looked at them with that same calm demeanor and said, "I'm the one you're looking for." With those words, one of the most elusive serial killers in American history was finally in custody. But the real shock was yet to come. Once Carl started talking, he didn't stop. He confessed to murder after murder, providing names, locations, and details that hadn't been released to the public. Investigators realized they weren't dealing with a local killer, but with a serial murderer who had operated on a national scale. The scope of Carl's crimes was staggering. Investigators suspected him of over 80 murders between Texas and Michigan alone, and some believed the real number was much higher. But there was a problem that would haunt the case for years to come. Carl had been incredibly careful throughout his killing spree. He never left forensic evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could definitively link him to the crime scenes. Prosecutors were terrified that despite his confessions, they wouldn't be able to convict him of the murders in court. So they made a deal that would outrage the public and the families of victims. Carl would confess to dozens of murders in exchange for immunity from prosecution for those crimes. He would only be charged with burglary an attempted murder related to the Aguilar and Lister case, receiving a 60-year prison sentence. The deal was controversial for another reason. Under Texas law at the time, Carl's crimes were classified as non-violent because there had been no sexual assault or robbery involved. This meant his sentence was lighter than it should have been, and he could potentially be eligible for parole in as little as 5 years. The public was outraged when they learned that a man with a body count stretching into the dozens might be released back into society. But Carl's fate wasn't sealed yet. Michigan authorities had been tracking his case, and they were determined to ensure he would never be free again. Detectives began re-examining cold cases, looking for unsolved murders that fit the timeline of Carl's known activities. One case in particular caught their attention: the 1979 murder of Helen Dutcher, who had been stabbed to death in her home. A witness had seen the attack years earlier, but the investigation had never properly followed up on the tip. In 2004, after more than 2 decades of silence, that witness identified Carl Watts in a police lineup. With this new evidence, Michigan authorities charged Carl with first-degree murder. Carl was extradited from Texas to Michigan, where he faced trial for Helen Dutcher's murder. The prosecution presented a compelling case, and Carl was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the investigation didn't stop there. Michigan authorities began linking him to over a dozen additional murders, cases that had been dismissed as accidents or had remained unsolved for years. Throughout his trials and imprisonment, Carl remained largely silent about his crimes. He offered no remorse, no explanations for his actions, no insight into what had driven him to kill so many innocent people. He seemed to view his murders as simply a job he had been compelled to do, nothing more significant than any other daily task. Carl Eugene Watts died in prison in September 2007 from prostate cancer. His death received little media attention, a fitting end for a killer who had spent his entire criminal career trying to remain invisible. Unlike other serial killers who craved fame and recognition, Carl had succeeded in staying anonymous even in death. The tragedy of Carl's story isn't just the lives he took, but the lives that were never properly acknowledged. Many of his victims remain unknown, their murders never officially connected to him. Families never received closure, never learned what happened to their loved ones. Carl took those secrets to his grave, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and unresolved pain. What made Carl Watts so dangerous wasn't just his ability to kill, but his ability to disappear. He moved through society like a ghost, taking lives and vanishing back into the crowd. He proved that the most terrifying monsters aren't always the ones who make headlines. Sometimes they're the ones who work in complete silence, leaving behind only death and the haunting knowledge that evil can hide in plain sight. His story serves as a chilling reminder that predators don't always fit our expectations. They don't always look dangerous or act suspiciously. Sometimes they're the unremarkable person walking past you on the street, the neighbor who keeps to himself, the stranger who seems perfectly ordinary. Now we reach the third and final case, and this one might be the most unsettling of all. Because unlike the previous killers we've discussed, this man didn't operate from the shadows of society's underbelly. He didn't live as a drifter or an outcast. Instead, he embedded himself so deeply into the fabric of his community that when the truth finally surfaced, it shattered everything people thought they knew about trust, safety, and the monsters that walk among us. His name was Dennis Rader, and for over 30 years, he lived a double life so perfectly crafted that even his own family had no idea they were sharing their home with one of the most methodical serial killers in American history. By day, he was a compliance officer, a church president, a Boy Scout leader, and a devoted family man. By night, he was BTK, bind, torture, kill, a predator who turned murder into a twisted art form. What makes Rader so terrifying isn't just what he did, it's how he did it. He didn't kill in moments of rage or desperation. He planned, he studied, he waited, sometimes for years. He would select his victims, learn their routines, break into their homes to familiarize himself with the layout, and then return later to execute his carefully choreographed nightmares. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated evil, performed by a man who could switch between killer and pillar of the community as easily as changing clothes. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, into what appeared to be a typical middle-class family. His father was a mechanic, his mother a bookkeeper, and by all accounts, his childhood was unremarkable. There were no obvious signs of the monster he would become, no history of severe abuse, no traumatic incidents that would later be pointed to as the root of his evil. He was just an ordinary boy in an ordinary family, which makes his transformation all the more chilling. But beneath the surface of normalcy, something dark was taking root. As a child, Rader displayed what experts would later recognize as the classic warning signs of a budding psychopath. He tortured animals, starting with insects and progressing to cats and dogs. He would hang them, strangle them, or trap them in boxes until they died. But this wasn't the impulsive cruelty of a disturbed child. Even then,